Black poor homeless pregnant maid bought a ruined castle. Uncovered buried secrets. Cold air filled the flooded basement as Tiffany Crawford pushed open a rusted iron door hidden behind fallen shelves. Her flashlight beam trembled across the darkness, revealing strange carvings on the stone, a star, a drinking gourd, and a series of marks. Water rippled around her boots as she stepped forward, staring into a tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly underground. 3 months earlier, she had been sleeping in her car behind a grocery store, 6 months pregnant and out of options. With her last $2,800, she bought this broken castle no one wanted. Now, standing in its basement, she had uncovered something far greater than shelter, a secret buried for more than a century that would rewrite American history. She didn't know it yet, but her discovery would connect her to a hidden past and give forgotten voices a chance to be heard again. Would you risk everything for one last chance at hope? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story will move you even more. Come and let's go through how it all started. Tiffany Crawford woke before dawn most mornings, long before the first light touched the streets of Richmond's Fan District. The house she worked in stood among rows of tall Victorian townhouses along Monument Avenue. Buildings filled with history, quiet money, and carefully polished respectability. Inside, she moved like part of the furniture, unseen but necessary. She knew every inch of the marble floors, every creak in the old stairway, every stain on the rugs that only she cared enough to scrub out. She had worked for the Hollands for almost 3 years. They were not cruel people, at least not openly. Mrs. Holland often called her such a blessing when guests were around, and Mr. Holland sometimes left tips tucked into folded towels, as though generosity could erase distance. Tiffany accepted it all with polite gratitude. She knew her place: clean, quiet, efficient, invisible. Each morning she made the family's breakfast, pressed their clothes, and tended to their 2 children before walking through the large rooms with a bucket and rag. Her day was a rhythm of silence: washing, dusting, polishing, folding. The pay was steady, and she was allowed to stay in a small room above the garage, a privilege, she reminded herself, compared to paying rent she couldn't afford elsewhere. When her pregnancy test showed 2 faint lines one Sunday afternoon, she cried, not out of fear, but relief. For months she had been saving carefully, counting every dollar from her weekly wages and the small holiday bonuses she received. The baby felt like a reason to keep going, a new start. She believed the Hollands would understand. After all, she had been loyal, never missed a day, and even worked through bouts of illness without complaint. She waited a week before telling Mrs. Holland. It was after breakfast, the house quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "I'm about 12 weeks along," Tiffany said softly, twisting her fingers together. "I plan to keep working as long as I can." Mrs. Holland's smile froze. She set down her coffee cup and adjusted her pearl bracelet. "Oh, Tiffany," she said in a tone that sounded kind but carried a sharp edge. "You should focus on your health now. We've been meaning to downsize the staff anyway. We'll give you a few weeks' pay and a letter of recommendation. You'll land on your feet." Tiffany's chest tightened. "I can still work," she said quickly. "I don't need time off yet." But Mrs. Holland had already stood up, smoothing her dress, ending the conversation with finality. "You've been wonderful. Truly. We'll always be grateful." 2 days later, Tiffany was packing her things into 2 worn suitcases. The little room above the garage looked smaller than ever. She folded her uniform one last time, laid it on the bed, and walked out with quiet dignity. The check they gave her covered barely 2 weeks of expenses. She called other families she'd worked for on occasion, seasonal help during the holidays, spring cleaning jobs, but none had openings. "Maybe after Christmas," one said. "Try us again in the spring," said another. Every polite refusal felt heavier than the last. Her savings amounted to just over $3,200. It wasn't much, but she guarded it fiercely. Each night she went over her notebook of expenses, calculating what she could cut. She planned for the baby in lists, diapers, formula, a used crib she saw online. She told herself she'd find another housekeeping job soon. Weeks passed. The job market was dry, and the ones she found paid less or required full-time lifting she couldn't manage while pregnant. Rent in Richmond had risen sharply. Even shared apartments cost more than she could handle. Her former employer's recommendation letter meant little when she showed up visibly pregnant. Landlords hesitated, interviewers smiled tightly, and no one called back. Still, she tried to keep her days organized. Each morning she woke early, walked to nearby churches and community centers, asking about temporary work or food banks. She ate one meal most days, a sandwich or something from the discount section of the grocery store. She reminded herself that things could still improve. She told herself that if she stayed patient, if she stayed kind, something would turn around. At night, she would place a hand over her stomach and whisper to her unborn child, "We're going to be okay. Mama's going to find us a home." It became a mantra she repeated to stay strong. She avoided pity from others, avoided asking for help unless absolutely necessary. Pride and exhaustion mixed in a quiet battle she carried alone. Her friends from high school were long gone, moved to other cities, busy with lives she could barely imagine now. Social media only deepened the distance. Pictures of weddings, vacations, new houses. She stopped checking after a while. It hurt too much to compare. Tiffany found brief peace in her routines. Cleaning had always given her a sense of control. She volunteered to tidy the local church once a week, partly to stay busy and partly because she could use the quiet sanctuary. The pastor sometimes gave her leftovers from community dinners, always thanking her with gentle words that made her eyes sting. When autumn came, the air turned cooler, and her belly began to show. She noticed how strangers' eyes lingered on her, some with pity, others with judgment. A woman alone, visibly pregnant, without fine clothes or wedding ring, seemed to invite unspoken stories people wrote for her in their minds. She kept walking, head high, pretending not to notice. By November, her options had narrowed to almost nothing. The Hollands check was long spent on temporary motels and bus fare to job interviews that led nowhere. She had no family nearby, no partner to share the burden. The few belongings she owned fit easily into the trunk of her old blue sedan, a car with peeling paint and a stubborn engine that coughed to life only after several tries. It was in that car that she started sleeping, first out of necessity, later out of habit. The small space became her world. Suitcases stacked on one side, a folded blanket on the other, and the soft rhythm of traffic outside lulling her to sleep. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that as long as the baby kept kicking, she had a reason to keep trying. Every day, she repeated the same promise in silence, "You will not be born into this. I'll find us a home." She didn't know how or where, only that she had to. The heater coughed once and went silent. Tiffany pressed her palms against the steering wheel of her old silver sedan, parked behind the Kroger on Broad Street. The air outside was sharp, thick with exhaust from passing traffic. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, watching her breath fog up the windshield. Every night she told herself it was temporary. Every morning, it felt less true. She had arranged the back seat into something that resembled a nest, clothes folded into makeshift pillows, grocery bags tucked under the seats. Her suitcase sat in the trunk, locked with a single strap. Inside were the only things she couldn't lose: her ultrasound photo, a few baby onuses she'd bought from the clearance bin, and a letter from her mother, now gone 2 years. Each day began before sunrise. She'd drive to the Exxon across the street to brush her teeth, pretending to be a traveler passing through. Afterward, she'd wait for the Kroger doors to slide open, just to walk through the aisles, to feel like part of the world again. The store clerks stopped noticing her after the first week. That suited her fine. The shelters were always full. When she called, the answers were polite but hopeless. "We can add your name to the list, but it might take a few months." Some suggested she try in Petersburg or Norfolk, as if she could afford the gas to get there. The city had programs for single mothers, but most required an address or employment, two things she'd lost long before her belly began to show. The Richmond winter was creeping closer. Leaves had already turned brittle, skimming across the Kroger parking lot in dry swirls. Tiffany's savings, once $3,200, were thinning fast. She spent carefully, a $1 coffee at 7-Eleven, canned soup heated on a small camping stove she'd found at a pawn shop. Gas had become her biggest luxury. Each night she asked herself whether it was safer to run the engine for warmth or save the fuel for the next job interview that never came. When the loneliness pressed too hard, she drove downtown to the public library on Franklin Street. The staff knew her by sight but never asked questions. The building became her second home: clean restrooms, charging outlets, and a quiet space where no one stared. She'd sit near the tall windows, scrolling through job listings she couldn't apply for without an address. Sometimes she read novels just to forget that she didn't have a door to close behind her anymore. Pregnancy had changed the way people looked at her. The same shoppers who once smiled at her uniform and name tag now averted their eyes when she walked past the produce section. Cashiers spoke to her like she was invisible. Some glanced at her stomach, then at her clothes, as if silently calculating mistakes. She'd learned to keep her head down, to whisper thank you even when kindness was absent. At night, the parking lot filled with other invisible lives: men in trucks, women in old vans, a teenager sleeping under the awning of the laundromat. They shared no words, only quiet recognition. Sometimes a stranger would tap on her window offering leftover food, and she'd force a smile through her embarrassment. Other times, security guards told her to move along, and she'd circle the block for an hour before returning once the lights dimmed. Her body grew heavier with each passing week. Simple things became harder: bending, climbing in and out of the car, finding a position that didn't make her back ache. She talked to her baby to stay calm, telling him about the places they'd see someday: the James River, Belle Isle, maybe even the ocean. It helped her forget the sound of the wind shaking the car. Rainstorms were the worst. The roof leaked through the seal near the rear window, dripping onto her blanket. She stuffed napkins and paper towels into the gap, praying it would hold. When she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was matted, her skin pale from exhaustion, her eyes swollen from crying in silence. One night, a police officer tapped on her window and told her she couldn't sleep there anymore. He wasn't cruel, just tired. This isn't safe," he said. Tiffany nodded, thanked him, and drove off, unsure where to go. She ended up near the James River, parked beneath an old bridge. The sound of rushing water mixed with the hum of passing cars overhead. She cried until she couldn't. The next morning, she promised herself something had to change. She couldn't bring a baby into metal walls and borrowed light. She decided she would find a place, any place, even if it meant risking what little she had left. As the first frost painted the edges of her windshield white, Tiffany tightened her scarf and whispered, "We're going to find a home." The words felt fragile, but they gave her a reason to start the engine again. The public library had become Tiffany's only constant. It was warm, quiet, and anonymous. She sat at her usual computer station near the window, her swollen hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of vending machine coffee. She wasn't sure what she was looking for that morning. Maybe temporary housing, maybe some kind of miracle. But what appeared on the screen was neither. It was a county auction notice that read, "Historic property for sale, as is. Minimum bid, $1,000. At first, she almost scrolled past it. The words historic property usually meant expensive repairs and impossible dreams. But something about it made her pause. She clicked the link, and there it was, Magnolia Castle, Lexington, Virginia. The pictures loaded slowly, as if the computer itself didn't believe what it was showing. A sprawling 19th-century mansion stood surrounded by overgrown grass and broken gates. The stone walls were veined with ivy. Windows were shattered, roof sections had collapsed, and what was once a grand front porch now leaned like a tired shoulder. The photographs looked tragic and beautiful all at once, a forgotten world frozen in decay. Tiffany leaned closer. The description said the property had been built in 1887 by a coal mining tycoon named Harrison Clymer. The family had owned it for 3 generations before tax debt forced the sale. Now the county wanted it gone. She whispered the words under her breath. Minimum bid, $1,000. Her heartbeat quickened. It sounded ridiculous. She barely had gas money, let alone the strength to restore a castle. Yet, something about that ruin pulled at her. It wasn't the fantasy of owning a mansion. It was the idea of walls, of shelter, of permanence. She searched more about Lexington. It was a small town tucked between hills, about 2 hours west of Richmond. Nearby were Washington and Lee University and the Virginia Military Institute. The castle sat on the outskirts, near Goshen Pass, where limestone cliffs met the Maury River. That same limestone, according to an old newspaper clipping she found, had been used to build the mansion itself. It had stood for over a century, surviving storms, neglect, and silence. Tiffany printed every page she found. The machine spit out faded sheets, maps, old photos, tax records. She folded them carefully into her worn notebook like they were precious documents. That night, she sat in her car reading them under the dim glow of her dashboard light. The numbers didn't make sense. Even if she bid and somehow won, she'd have to pay taxes, repairs, utilities. But the thought of another freezing night behind Kroger made logic feel cruel. The next morning, she packed what little food she had left, filled her gas tank halfway, and pointed her car west toward Lexington. The drive felt endless. Her sedan shuddered on every hill, the check engine light flickering like a heartbeat. She kept her eyes on the mountains that rose in the distance, massive and gray, like they'd been waiting centuries for her arrival. By the time she reached the county line, her gas gauge hovered just above empty. The air smelled cleaner, almost sweet. She followed a narrow road that curved between trees and farmland until she saw a rusted sign, Magnolia Road. Her stomach fluttered. The castle appeared slowly through the trees, taller than she expected. Its stone walls were streaked with moss, its roof a patchwork of rot and sunlight. Birds flew in and out of broken windows. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, afraid to step out. The county auction took place in a small, echoing courtroom in Lexington. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper. There were only 5 people there that morning: a clerk, 2 men in suits waiting for another property, a tired janitor, and Tiffany. She sat quietly at the back, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her notebook. When the auctioneer read the listing, Magnolia Castle, Parcel 22B, no one raised a hand. The clerk sighed, ready to move on. Tiffany hesitated for a long moment before lifting hers. 2,800, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the silence. The gavel hit the block once. Sold. It was over in seconds. She blinked, half certain she had misheard. The clerk handed her a receipt with shaking hands, and reality hit her. She now owned a castle. A broken one, but hers. She left the courthouse numb. The weight of the paper in her hand felt heavier than gold. She had only $400 left in her account, a car that barely ran, and nowhere else to go. Still, for the first time in a long while, she had a place that belonged to her name. 2 days later, she arrived at Magnolia Castle with everything she owned stuffed into the back seat of her sedan: 2 duffel bags, a box of canned food, and her late mother's warm blanket. The main doors were swollen shut, so she slipped in through the servant's entrance at the side. It groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Her flashlight caught dust floating like ash in the beam. She decided to sleep in the butler's pantry that night, one of the few rooms with a door that's still closed. She taped cardboard over the broken window and laid the blanket on the floor. Her camping stove hissed softly as she heated a can of soup. The ceiling creaked above her, and rainwater dripped through a crack in the corner. But despite it all, she smiled. For the first time in months, she wasn't in a parking lot. In the morning, she filled plastic jugs with water from the basement tap. The pipes rattled, spitting rust, but it was something. She swept out fallen plaster and stacked debris into corners, clearing just enough space to walk safely. Word spread quickly through town. People at the Food Lion stared when she came in with her swollen belly and dusty clothes. Some whispered. Others just looked confused. Who would buy that castle? Why her? Still, a few faces showed kindness. The old librarian who had helped her with research recognized her and brought over a stack of books on basic home repair. "You'll need these more than anyone else," she said with a smile. The next person was a hardware store owner named Frank. He noticed her struggling to lift a bucket of nails to the counter and asked what she was fixing. When she told him where she lived, he blinked in surprise, then nodded slowly. "That place has been empty longer than I've been alive," he said. Later that week, she found a box of supplies left by her car with a note: "Damaged goods, free if you can use them." The items weren't new, but they worked: gloves, a hammer, nails, and a lantern. Days turned into a rhythm. Each morning, she cleared another room. She sealed leaks with tar from the hardware store, stuffed insulation into gaps, and covered the basement windows with plastic sheeting. The place was still falling apart, but she was determined to make at least one corner livable before the baby came. At night, she'd sit on a bucket in the kitchen, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks. Her back ached constantly, and her fingers were raw from cleaning. Yet, when she looked around at the stone walls, she felt something stronger than exhaustion: ownership. Every small repair, every patch of cleared floor, was a victory. She didn't talk much to anyone in town, except for the librarian who checked in on her every few days. Sometimes the woman would bring sandwiches or gently used baby clothes. Other times, she'd just sit with Tiffany for a while, talking about how the castle used to host Christmas galas back in the early 1900s. Those stories gave Tiffany quiet comfort. It felt like she was reviving something that had been long forgotten. By December, she had managed to make the basement safe enough to sleep in when the nights turned colder. She used old bricks to prop up her small bed frame, kept her food in sealed containers to avoid mice, and lined the walls with blankets for insulation. The faint sound of wind through broken upper windows became her nightly lullaby. She was exhausted, sore, and scared of what winter might bring. But in the silence of the castle, she found a strange peace. Every time she touched her belly, she reminded herself that she wasn't just rebuilding a home, she was rebuilding a life. Outside, frost began to form on the weeds. The castle loomed tall and broken against the pale sky. Yet within its walls, something new was beginning to grow: hope, fragile but real. Tiffany didn't know what the next day would bring, but she was no longer running. For the first time, she was standing her ground. By late January, the cold had settled deep into the valley. Tiffany, now 6 months pregnant, spent most of her days in the basement, working slowly but steadily to make it livable before the baby came. Her movements were slower now, her back ached constantly, but she refused to stop. The basement had become her mission, a place where she could control at least one corner of her world. The stone walls sweated from trapped moisture, and she'd set up a small electric heater powered by an extension cord running from the upstairs outlet. Each morning, she'd clear more debris, rotted boxes, warped shelves, fragments of the past buried under years of neglect. It was during one of those cleaning sessions that she noticed something strange. Behind a row of collapsed wooden shelving, the stone wall didn't look right. It had a faint seam, a line that didn't match the rest of the masonry. She brushed away the dust and found a patch of corroded metal beneath it. Her pulse quickened. She pulled the shelves aside, each movement echoing through the basement. Beneath the rubble was an iron door, its hinges thick with rust, the handle sealed by corrosion. It was about 5 feet high, too small for normal use, and had a circular lock plate in the center. For a long time, she just stared. Curiosity warred with fear. The castle had already surprised her enough times, and she wasn't sure she could handle another. But something about that door felt important, like it had been waiting for her to find it. She wedged a pry bar between the edge of the frame and leaned her weight against it. The metal groaned but didn't move. She tried again, pushing harder. Her muscles strained, breath coming fast. Finally, with a screech, the lock snapped and the door creaked open a few inches. Cold, stale air poured out. Tiffany crouched, shining her flashlight through the opening. The beam revealed a narrow passageway cut directly into the earth, about 6 feet tall, its walls lined with wooden beams for support. The air smelled of clay and history. The ground was damp beneath her shoes as she stepped forward. Near the entrance, she noticed carvings etched into the stone lintel, a star, a drinking gourd, and a line of tally marks. She recognized the symbols immediately. She had read about them during a history lesson years ago. They were marks used by enslaved people as signs along escape routes to freedom. Her chest tightened. Could this tunnel really be that old? She pressed further, careful to steady herself as the light flickered across the rough walls. The tunnel stretched farther than she expected, turning slightly before descending deeper underground. Wooden planks had been nailed into the ground as makeshift steps. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. After about 200 yards, the narrow passage opened suddenly into a wide chamber. Her light danced across the walls and caught something that made her freeze. Names. Hundreds of them. They were carved directly into the limestone, each letter rough but deliberate. Some were full names, others initials, some only a single word like hope or freedom. The dates beside them spanned decades: 1852, 1863, 1878, 1889. Tiffany's knees went weak. She reached out and touched one of the carvings with her fingertips. The grooves were shallow but deep enough to feel the effort behind each stroke. Whoever had made them had wanted to be remembered. She moved slowly along the wall, her flashlight tracing more words. Isaac, 1854. Mary Ellen, 1867. J. Carter, 1883. The marks filled every surface. Some areas showed rows of tally marks grouped in fives, perhaps days spent waiting. Further in, she saw evidence that this place had once been carefully constructed. Wooden platforms stood against the walls, now rotted but still recognizable as bunk frames or storage shelves. Small clay jars sat on the floor, some still sealed with hardened wax. She lifted one and heard something rattle inside but didn't open it. Near the far end, she found vertical shafts extending upward. They were narrow and lined with stones, ventilation tunnels disguised from the surface, she realized, possibly hidden by sinkholes or covered with brush. Whoever built this had known how to hide it well. Her flashlight caught something else, a faint reflection from the far wall. She crossed the uneven ground and saw a cluster of small metal tags hammered into the rock. They were tin, stamped with numbers and letters. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. These weren't random marks, they were identification tags. Tiffany sank to her knees, overwhelmed. Her baby kicked gently, as if sensing the moment's weight. She whispered, "You were meant to see this." She stayed there for nearly an hour, barely breathing, afraid the silence would swallow her if she spoke too loud. Every inch of that chamber told a story of fear, hope, and survival. These people had carved their lives into stone so they wouldn't vanish from history. When she finally turned back toward the tunnel, her flashlight flickered. The path seemed longer on the way out, the walls closing in, her mind racing with questions. Who built this? Why was it hidden under a castle? How many had passed through here, risking everything for freedom long after slavery had supposedly ended? She stepped back into the basement, gasping for fresh air, covered in dust and shaking. The iron door still hung open behind her. She sat on the floor, pressing her hand against her belly. The discovery felt larger than her, larger than the castle itself. That night, she couldn't sleep. The names haunted her, whispering from the walls of her memory. She knew she had found something extraordinary, not just a piece of history, but a bridge between the forgotten and the living. Whatever this place was, she was now its witness. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she couldn't keep it hidden. Not after what she saw. Tiffany barely slept the night she found the names carved into the cave walls. The lantern light flickering against hundreds of inscriptions stayed with her long after she climbed back up the tunnel. Each name felt alive, like whispers of those who had once passed through this hidden place, fighting for a freedom that history barely mentioned. By morning, she had charged her old phone, its cracked screen barely holding together, and began taking hundreds of photos. Every symbol, every date, every letter carved into the stone, she documented them all. She stored the images on a USB stick she bought from the dollar store, labeling it The Cave. Between cooking on her portable stove and hauling water from the spring, she spent hours scrolling through those photos, trying to piece together what this underground passage had once meant. When the small-town library reopened after the weekend, Tiffany walked the 2 miles there. She looked out of place among students and retirees, her work boots still muddy from the basement. She sat at a public computer and began searching for clues. At first, she looked for Virginia cave tunnels, then secret passages, and finally underground railroad near Lexington. What she found made her heart race. The Underground Railroad was supposed to have ended in 1865, when slavery was abolished. Yet, according to a few scattered records and obscure articles, some stations in rural Virginia had continued operating for decades afterward. It didn't make sense at first, until Tiffany stumbled across reports about how freedom had only changed in name, not in practice. She learned about the Black Codes, laws passed right after the war that restricted newly freed people's rights. Many couldn't own land, vote, or even leave their employer's property without written permission. That pushed them into sharecropping, which sounded fair on paper but kept families trapped in endless debt. Worse still was the convict lease system, where men were arrested on false charges and leased out to work for private companies, another form of bondage. As Tiffany read, the realization struck her: the people who carved their names in that cave hadn't been fleeing slavery as it was defined before the Civil War, they were escaping the new slavery that followed it. That was why the dates on the walls extended into the late 1880s. The network hadn't ended. It had adapted. She printed maps from the library's archives, tracing the direction of the tunnel she had walked. Its path pointed northwest, toward Natural Bridge, a massive limestone arch about 15 miles away. It was a known landmark even in the 1800s. Hidden beneath it were rumored cave systems stretching for miles. If her calculations were right, the tunnel beneath her property might have connected directly to that network, a secret highway for those seeking safe passage long after the country declared them free. Back at the castle, Tiffany continued exploring. Near the far end of the cave, she found a shaft leading upward, lined with old timber beams. When she climbed halfway up with her flashlight, she noticed a layer of soil and stone covering the top. Above it, Faint roots dangled through cracks. It wasn't a natural opening. It was disguised. She realized it might have once served as a ventilation shaft, camouflaged from above as a harmless sinkhole, allowing air to circulate while keeping the cave hidden. Whoever had designed it had known exactly what they were doing. Her next stop was the Lexington County Historical Archive, a small brick building beside the courthouse. There, with the help of a kind clerk, Tiffany sifted through microfilm newspapers from the 1800s. She searched for any reference to the castle's original owner, Judge Alaric Mendenhall. Most articles were mundane, mentions of court rulings, estate sales, and family gatherings. But one headline from 1871 caught her attention. Local landowner accused of harboring runaways. Neighbors protest his kindness to the Collards. The article was vague, written in the language of the time, but the implication was clear. Judge Mendenhall had been suspected of helping freedmen flee the region. Though no charges were ever proven, the piece mentioned unexplained activity on his property and strange lights in the hills. Tiffany leaned back in her chair, her pulse racing. The clues aligned perfectly. The tunnel, the symbols, the carved names. None of it was random. The so-called castle hadn't been built for luxury or vanity. It had been constructed with a mission, to continue the work of liberation, even when the law claimed freedom had already been granted. For the next few nights, Tiffany couldn't shake the weight of what she had discovered. She kept revisiting the cave, running her fingers over the rough stone, whispering some of the names she had memorized: Martha, 1874. Samuel, 1881. Josiah, 1885. She wondered who they had been, where they had gone, and whether they had ever reached safety. She needed help, someone who could confirm her findings. On one of her late nights at the library, she came across an article by Dr. Patricia Greenfield, a professor of historical archaeology at Virginia Tech. The article described hidden post-war networks used by freed people to escape exploitative labor contracts. Dr. Greenfield's writing mentioned similar tunnel structures found in abandoned farmhouses near Roanoke. Without overthinking, Tiffany composed an email. Her hands trembled as she typed, attaching photos of the cave carvings, the symbols at the tunnel entrance, and a rough map she had drawn on notebook paper. She ended with a simple line: "I think I found something important under my house." She didn't expect a reply, at least not soon. But the next morning, her phone buzzed. It was an email from Dr. Greenfield herself. "Ms. Crawford, this is extraordinary. Can you confirm your location? I'm in Blacksburg. I'd like to come as soon as possible." Tiffany sat on the edge of her bed, the same creaky frame she'd salvaged from the castle storage room, staring at the message. For the first time since she had stepped into that ruined house months ago, she felt the past and present collide. The story she had stumbled into wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about generations who had used the same ground beneath her feet to survive in their own way. As the winter wind rattled through the castle's broken windows, Tiffany realized something powerful. The place that had sheltered her from homelessness was once a sanctuary for people seeking a far deeper kind of freedom. Dr. Patricia Greenfield arrived 3 days after her email reply, stepping out of a white van marked Virginia Tech Archaeology Program. With her came 3 graduate students, all carrying tripods, laser scanners, and waterproof cases. Tiffany stood by the castle's front steps, her hands nervously clasped, as the team unpacked equipment on the patch of gravel that once served as a carriage drive. From the moment Dr. Greenfield stepped inside the basement, her expression shifted from curiosity to awe. She ran her hand over the tunnel's entrance, whispering softly, This could change our understanding of post-war resistance." For Tiffany, hearing that felt like validation for every sleepless night she'd spent wondering whether anyone would believe her. For the next several weeks, the quiet property buzzed with activity. Students recorded every inch of the tunnel, using 3D scanners and ground-penetrating radar. They photographed layers of soil, measured wood grain in the beams, and carefully collected small fragments that had been buried for more than a century. Tiffany helped where she could, clearing debris, labeling boxes, and fetching water for the crew. One morning, a student's voice echoed from the far end of the cave, "Dr. Greenfield, you need to see this." They had found a small wooden chest tucked behind a limestone outcrop. Inside were several items wrapped in what looked like old quilt fabric, a handful of brass buttons, a rusted pocket knife, a cornhusk doll with one arm missing, and a letter sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled at the edges. Later that afternoon, they uncovered a cluster of old photographs protected in a tin case. Faded but still visible, the pictures showed black families posing beside wagons and wooden cabins. On the back of one photo, a faint inscription read, "Safe Now, 1882." Over the following weeks, the artifacts were catalogued and sent to Virginia Tech's Conservation Lab. Dr. Greenfield kept Tiffany updated through handwritten notes left on her kitchen table. One of them read, "Carbon dating confirms the site was active between the 1850s and early 1890s. Heaviest use, 1867 to 1878, Reconstruction era. You were right." Each discovery deepened the story. The carved names Tiffany had photographed were cross-referenced against old census records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and church registries from counties across Virginia and Maryland. Out of nearly 400 names, more than 60 appeared again years later, this time in places like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. They had re-emerged under slightly altered surnames or newly adopted family names. It was proof that many had escaped and built new lives far from the lands that once enslaved them. One entry from the Freedmen's Bureau particularly struck Tiffany. A man listed as Joseph Mendenhall, formerly enslaved, carpenter, age 34, relocated from Lexington to Pennsylvania, 1872. The last name matched the castle's builder. It became clear that Judge Alaric Mendenhall had not only constructed a refuge but had also helped at least one man, possibly someone from his own estate, secure a new start in the North. By late January, Tiffany's body had grown heavy with pregnancy. Even as the team continued their documentation, she often sat in the great room wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow gather on the window ledges. Sometimes Dr. Greenfield joined her, sharing coffee and stories about how history often hides in forgotten places. "You've preserved more than a building," the professor told her one evening. "You've protected a piece of truth that would have been lost." On February 12th, after a night of contractions that left her gripping the edge of her mattress, Tiffany was rushed to Carilion Stonewall Jackson Hospital. Dr. Greenfield herself drove her there in her old Subaru, steadying Tiffany's hand the entire way. By dawn, Tiffany gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Hope. The nurses smiled when they heard it, unaware that the name carried the weight of generations. To Tiffany, Hope represented not only her own survival but also the spirit of every person who had passed through those hidden tunnels, determined to live, to find light beyond confinement. When she returned home 2 weeks later, something incredible had begun to happen. Word of her discovery had spread throughout the county. Local churches sent volunteers to repair the castle's roof and reinforce the windows. A nearby lumberyard donated planks to rebuild the porch. Someone from the county office stopped by to deliver a letter waiving the year's property tax, a gesture of gratitude for what the site meant to history. By early spring, the castle no longer looked abandoned. The ivy had been trimmed back, the walls scrubbed clean. The once collapsing basement door now bore a small plaque donated by a local historical society, the Crawford Underground Sanctuary, 1852-1890s. Tiffany spent long evenings sitting near the tunnel entrance, cradling Hope in her arms. The air from below still carried a faint coolness, but it no longer felt haunting. It felt sacred. She often thought about how her life had mirrored the lives of those whose names were carved into the stone, both seeking safety, both finding it in the same place more than a century apart. She had once been seen as someone with nothing, a homeless woman, a burden, a statistic. Yet now, her discovery had brought historians, students, and communities together. It had turned an overlooked ruin into a living archive of courage. One afternoon, while walking along the property, Tiffany noticed the sun breaking through the clouds, casting light across the roof she'd once feared would collapse on her. She paused, realizing how far she'd come. She wasn't just preserving history, she was continuing it. The castle had protected others before her. Now, it protected her and her daughter. It stood as proof that the same walls which once sheltered the forgotten could still become a home, not of despair, but of redemption. Tiffany Crawford proved that society's castaways, whether people or buildings, hold extraordinary value. Her story reminds us that strength often grows from the very moments we wish had never happened. She turned loss into purpose, and what others saw as ruin became a place of remembrance and renewal. Now it's your turn to reflect. What's a time when you found strength in your darkest moment? Share your story in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voices from every corner of the world. If Tiffany's journey moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel because tomorrow we're bringing another powerful story you won't want to miss. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their circumstances don't define their worth. Your support helps keep these stories alive, reminding the world that hope can rise from the hardest places, and that even the forgotten can change history.